They have a plan to basically bring down, the retirement age to 60. They want to boost spending power. They want to strengthen public services. They want to open the country to immigration. They want to boost green energy. Their plan is to tax the rich. This extra money is going to finance all the measures.
A Sunday surprise. Election results in France show a left coalition has won in the second round, relegating to third place the extreme right-wing National Rally Party and its allies. But a split government in the European Union's second largest economy could have ramifications across the continent. For more, I'm joined by my colleague Lisa Lewis in Paris. Lisa, the new Popular Front won a slight majority, but it's not an absolute majority. What does that mean? Is it time for a coalition agreement?
Well, absolutely. But, it's really difficult for the French to form such a coalition. They're not used to it, as opposed to other countries such as Germany. Here in France, normally you've got a strong president, and normally that president has majority in parliament, and the government will do as the president says. There have been 3 occasions in French recent history where you had a so-called Cohabitation, which basically means that the government and the prime minister are from a different political party than the president, and that didn't go that well. Now, though, as you said, there is a parliament that is pretty much a hung parliament as we look at it, at least if they don't come together, if the far right, the center, and the left-wing coalition don't manage to work together. That being said, it's quite unlikely that the far right will be part of the mix, but what needs to happen now is that the president and the left and the center need to talk to each other and come up with a plan, really.
Let's talk about the NFP. Tell us, what are some of the economic priorities of this left-leaning coalition?
Well, it's a left-wing coalition that includes a far-left movement, which is called France Unbowed, under a very well-known, very aggressive former leader, Jean-Luc Mélenchon. They have a plan to basically bring down, the retirement age to 60. They want to boost spending power. They want to strengthen public services. They want to open the country to immigration. They want to boost green energy. Now, the far left movement is just one part of that coalition. There are 4 parties. The other parties are the Socialist Party, the Green Party, and the Communists. And that means that the far left, LFE, the France Unbowed, is very unlikely to put in place their whole program. So we should see what they're pushing for, what they're likely to push for is an agenda that is obviously leaning further to the left than what President Macron has been doing over the past 7 years, since he was elected in 2017. When he was elected at the time, he was actually promising that he would put in place left-wing and right-wing policies. But it turns out that most of his policies, most of the laws that he's been pushing through, rather conservative laws. So the left-wing coalition that has now won the biggest share of the seats in parliament is obviously adamant to change that.
And the NFP has said that they expect to increase public revenues by tens of billions of euros this year alone. Tell us, how is that even possible?
Well, their plan is to tax the rich. They just want to create extra tax breaks, and then everybody, who earns very, very much money, they need to pay, and then this extra money is going to finance all the measures. There have been economists talking about that, saying it is theoretically possible, but there's the big question is obviously if, when you increase taxes, there's the risk that those who are very rich, who also by themselves actually quite mobile, they can move from one country to another quite easily, as opposed to people who don't have the means to do that. So will they stay in France and pay these taxes or not? We'll see.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about tax, which leads me to the perilous economic state that France is in right now, especially when it comes to public debt. Taking a look at the French deficit as compared to the EU average, you can see here, last year French spending meant its deficit was 5.5% higher than French gross domestic product. The ratio is expected to shrink this year and next, but would still be above a 3% line that the EU has put as its deficit criterion. And you can see that French debt is expected to remain above the EU average, at least this year and next. Now, the reason I'm bringing up debt levels here is because there's really only a few ways to reduce debt: raising revenues, like we've talked about, or cutting spending. We've outlined a little bit about raising revenues, but how likely are raising revenues or spending cuts at this point, Lisa?
Well, spending cuts are rather unlikely unless Macron really negotiates quite well. But as I said, this is going to be a very tough negotiation. There's also already going on some towing and throwing going on in the background. The far left party is sitting together as we speak, trying to put forward the name of a possible prime minister. Other parties will do the same, but it's very unlikely that there will be big spending cuts, because the left-wing parties are, they are in favor of a stronger public service. They're also in favor of higher wages, and all that costs money. Another thing that the left is actually pushing for is more renewable energy, and I just want to mention that point, because that's really completely different to what the Rassemblement, the far-right national rally, was pleading for. They would actually, if they had won the elections, they were pushing for a halt of new wind turbines, for example, to install across France, and that would have had a big impact on France, because France also has a very ambitious agenda roadmap when it comes to renewable energy. So, all these different points need to be taken into account looking ahead to the future. As I said, the only way to raise extra money, at least when you look at the plan brought forward by the left, is to raise taxes. However, this new coalition came together just a few weeks ago as actually quite a rush actually after the EU elections, because to everybody's surprise, President Macron called this snap legislative election, and the left parties that are traditionally quite divided in France, that's actually that has been their biggest problem over the past few decades. They then, in a hurry, came together with, and came up with this new platform, but with an agreement that was, agreed overnight, so to say. So it looks like this is unlikely to be set in stone, and there will be lots of negotiations going on over the coming weeks.
Yeah, and speaking of negotiations, last year President Macron introduced a controversial pension reform plan. I assume that's going to be a big topic of negotiation, because the NFP, not big plans of these reform plans. Can you tell us where they stand on the reform plans and what changes they want to see?
Well, they don't only, they're saying that they're not only going to, withdraw the pension, that controversial pension reform, which pushed up the minimum retirement age from 62 to 64, but they're adamant they want to bring down the retirement age to 60 years. Now, this is the French pension system is based on redistribution, and as in many other countries, the population is growing older. So economists have been saying over the years that the pension system needs to be reformed. That would obviously be very costly for French finances and push up the deficit even further. As you just mentioned earlier, the deficit is quite high already in France. So that would certainly also be a worry for investors here in France and abroad.
How likely are changes to this reform that Macron really staked a lot of political capital on last year? Have there been indications since the results came through that there's wiggle room on his end to move towards anything that the NFP has to say about the reforms?
Well, as I said, the NFP's platform says we want to go down to 60 years as a minimum retirement age. However, there's also the Socialist Party, the Green Party in the mix, and they have said we're going to withdraw the reform, which would go, bring back the minimum retirement age to 62. There might be some movement that they go to an intermediate age. Who knows? What's really important, though, is that they're going to push for Macron to put in place even further reforms. There's also a unemployment benefit reform that is in the cards, and that is, as we speak, on ice. So we'll see what happens to that. Another law, very controversial law, was the immigration law that strengthened rules for immigrants coming to France. And the left-wing alliance has also said that they wanted that law to be withdrawn. So there might be some negotiation going on in that sense. Also because one argument, obviously, from the left is that France needs more immigrants because it's lacking workforce in certain sectors such as restaurants and hotels, as is also the case in other countries such as Spain or Portugal.
Well, the NFP has been grabbing headlines today, but Macron's Ensemble Alliance and the National Rally were in second and third place in this election. What are the economic priorities of these other two blocs, and how will their views impact the National Assembly's legislative priorities, especially when the NFP's majority is so small?
Well, it's quite unlikely that the far-right National Rally will be able to put anything in place of their program. They were planning, for example, to bring down VAT on electricity, fuel, etc., from 20 to about 5%. They also wanted to reduce the amount of money that France is paying to the EU budget. It's one of the biggest payers in Europe, actually, the country. But given that the other blocs in Parliament are unlikely to form an alliance with the far right, they're probably not going to be able to put these measures in place. When you look at the other bloc, which came second, Macron's alliance, they are pushing for more reforms. Macron has been known as a president who's been putting in place pro-business reforms, market-orientated reforms. Also, it's improved France's image over the past few years. He wanted to transform the country into a start-up nation. And it's actually quite an important country for startups and for investors. So he's quite unlikely to push for even more reforms. We'll see how much of what he's put in place will have to be taken back in order to form that alliance with the left.
It seems like who's going to be leading the charge within the left coalition is still being hashed out today from what I've gathered. But tell us what economic priorities could be at the front for a left-center coalition or some kind of cohabitation between a left leadership in the National Assembly and Macron in the president's office. How might that work?
I think the different camps, at least the center and the left, agree on the fact that they want to strengthen purchasing power. So there might be a higher minimum wage in the cards. They also agree on the fact that they want to boost green energy, renewable energy. Macron is also pushing for new nuclear reactors. That's not a no-go for the left. So these are areas where they might agree, obviously, how to go about this and how to spread the cost, amongst rich people or less well-off people here in France, entrepreneurs and employees. That still needs to be negotiated in the coming weeks.
And looking back to previous split governments, how have they worked together? Is there a positive track record of this kind of cohabitation or not so much?
It's not really a positive track record. There have been, as I said, 3 occasions under which there have been these cohabitation, and basically the president and the prime minister were strongly opposed in their views. The president, when you look at the French constitution, is kind of in charge of foreign policy, although that is not very clear in the French constitution. So, when you had a left-leaning president, he was trying to block market-orientated reforms, or, for example, privatizations. When President Mitterrand, who was a left-leaning president, was trying to block such reforms from governments from the other side, political side. So it's not really something that that has worked out quite well. That being said, the president normally has this trump card of dissolving the parliament. Now that President Macron just dissolved parliament, he can't do that again for another year, which gives the government, if there is one, a little bit more leeway, because in the past, the president could say, if you do this, I'm going to dissolve parliament, then you can't do this reform. So, in any case, as I said, France will need to learn how to form coalitions, how to work under coalitions, how to find agreements from, amongst parties that are really opposed also when it comes to economic views.
Last month in June, after he called the election, President Macron seemed to imply that both the far right and the so-called far left would bring France to the brink of a financial catastrophe. Can you put this into context? Is far left a fair term to use to describe any of these parties? And how outside the mainstream are some of the left bloc's economic priorities?
Well, I say, I mean, this was the impression that you'd get listening to economists ahead of, the first round of voting specifically. But the thing is that one economist pointed out to me that the far right's economic platform was really not very precise. They kept changing what they would want to do. So it was not possible to seriously assess what they would do. And so when Macron said, vote for me because otherwise you'll have the extremes in power, it was not entirely fair in that it looked like the far right was likely to get a large majority, which now hasn't happened. It was unlikely for the left-wing alliance to get a majority. But even if it were to become the biggest bloc, which has now happened without the majority though, within the left-wing alliance, as I said, there are 4 different parties, and there's just one which is actually quite radical and drastic in their views when it comes also to economic policy. So comparing the two on an economic level was probably not really fair.
And turning to markets, what kind of reaction are we seeing on the markets since the results came through?
When you look at the different stock indexes, you can see that there's a lot of nervousness. There's been quite a lot of volatility since this morning. As you said earlier, the elections results were really not expected. Even I was last night at the far right's National Election Party, and everybody was really surprised when they saw that the left came out as the winner of this parliamentary election. However, given that it's unlikely that they'll be able to put in place their whole, the most drastic measures, because they will have to work together with parties from other political sides, it looks like the biggest risk now is that there will be instability, that there's, the unknown, obviously, because France has never been in such territories, as uncharted territories, really, for France and for Europe. And that's what investors are seeing. So there's the risk, that there is still stand in France, but it doesn't look likely that there will be a big, change in economic policy. So investors are watching this very closely and are a bit nervous, but they're not completely nervous, I'd say.
Lisa Lewis, DW correspondent, joining us from Paris. Lisa, thank you.